Good morning. Good morning. That's more like it. So welcome. My name is Professor Chido Nwankwo, and we are delighted to have you here with us today, and the team is excited to present to you the work they have been doing in the past year. Year after year, through its curricular and co-curricular activities, the SAIS Women Lead has created a space for our students to engage with their passions of contributing to making the world a better and more equitable place through partnering with clients, both in the public, private, and non-governmental organizations, while building skills to make them competitive in the labor market and for a successful career. Graduates of the SAIS Women Lead Practicum program have always successfully drawn on their practicum experiences during interviews and also for successful job placements. The teams have worked hard this year overcoming constraints around inability to travel for their primary data collection and other things to produce stellar reports for their clients. Well done. Well done. I also want to take this opportunity to thank members of the SAIS Alumni Network who has been with us year in, year out, and have continued to support the SAIS Women Lead. In particular, we greatly appreciate Marshall Millsap, who is joining us from Denver, online from Denver today, whose dedication and commitment and sponsorship has been empowering for us. Thank you also, Emmy Heschrich, Sarah O'Hagan, Setu, Julie Misek, Events and IT. We couldn't have done this without you. And so we have with us today the Dean, as you can notice, and we are really very honored to have him with us today. And his presence here tells a story, right? A story that we are watching unfold, and one which we know will be great not only for the SAIS Women Lead, but also for SAIS. Hi, Georgia. James B Steinberg is the 10th Dean of SAIS. Previously, he served as University Professor of Social Sciences, International Affairs, and Law at Syracuse University, where he was Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs for 5 years. Prior, he served as Deputy Secretary of State to Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton from 2009 to 2011. From 2005 to 2008, Steinberg was Dean of the Lyon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. From 2001 to 2005, Professor Steinberg was Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institute. Professor Steinberg was Deputy National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton from 1996 to 2002. Steinberg's most recent books are A Glass Half Full, Rebalance, Reassurance, and Resolve, and Strategic Reassurance and Resolve, US-China Relations in the 21st Century. He has also authored Difficult Transitions, Foreign Policy Troubles at the Outset of Presidential Power with Kurt Campbell, as many as other numerous works. Professor Steinberg received his AB from Harvard College and a JD from Yale Law School. We are so honored that you're here with us. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Professor Nwankwo, and the honor is all mine, actually. I'm really pleased to be here and enormously impressed by this program and the work that you all have done as part of it. You know, this program, the SAIS Women's Lead, fits so centrally into the mission of the school, which is to understand the 21st century world in which we live and the dynamic forces that shape that world. And I think it's apparent to all of you, and needs to be more apparent to others, about the central role that women play in that world, and understanding the role of women, the role of gender in shaping the forces of the international environment are critically important today. And the other reason why it's so exciting is because what I love about this program is the way that it integrates the classroom experience and the learning that we're doing in our courses with the field work, the engagement in the real world, and in research. These are the elements that kind of make the dynamism here at SAIS work. And it's that translation of ideas into practice which makes such a difference. And so to see this, and from my own experience, to know the central role that women have played in issues of development and issues of peace and security over the years. I had the privilege of working, for example, on the Northern Ireland peace process, where, as I think many of you know, the women's movement played a critical role in helping to bring an end to that bitter and long-standing conflict. And we've seen this in so many other places in the world, understanding the potential and the power of women and women leaders to make a difference, but also the challenges and the obstacles that they face. And the kind of research and projects that you've done really reflect that, and the diversity of ways in which we think about the role of women and the way we think about the role of gender in international affairs is something that you bring to this, and we are committed very strongly here at SAIS to make that central to the work we do and to represent this kind of diversity that, just looking around this room, you so clearly represent, is key to understanding the world in which you all are studying now and will go on to work in practice. I'm really impressed, by the variety of the projects that you come up with this year. I mean, they really do span a full range of things and help us understand both the specific challenges that you've done this research on in these wonderful projects, but also really illustrating the range of ways that we need to think about the role of women and the contribution that women can make and the barriers that they face in international relations. So congratulations to all of you, to Professor Nawankar for your incredible leadership on this, and to the SAIS alumni who played a big role in making this happen. So thank you all.
And so for our keynote, we are excited to have with us today a friend of the program. Radhika Prabhu is a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, U.S. Department of State. Radhika leads the Bureau of South and Central Asian Outreach Affairs efforts to promote policies and diplomatic outreach to advance inclusive and equitable growth in economies across the South and Central Asia region. In this position, she also serves as Executive Director of the U.S.-India Alliance for Women's Economic Empowerment and U.S.-Pakistan Women's Council, two public-private partnerships accelerating equity and women's economic empowerment in India and Pakistan, respectively. Radhika previously served as a senior policy advisor and as a special assistant in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the State Department. Her work resulted in the department's first policies to promote women's economic empowerment in major trade agreements, strategic dialogues, and public-private partnerships in both South Asia and Iraq. Radhika has also held positions at the World Bank, United Nations Development Program, and the Inter-American Development Bank, focusing on innovation, climate change, and small and medium enterprise development. Radhika is a term member on the Council on Foreign Relations. In 2009, she was named a 2019 AAPI American National Security and Foreign Policy Next Generation Leader by the New America and Diversity in National Security Network. She's the recipient of the department's Superior Honor Award and several meritorious honor awards. Radhika holds a Master of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Boston College. Radhika has been an instructor with the Arts of Living Foundation for more than 20 years. And we are so glad to have you here. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm really thrilled and just want to commend you all starting out on such amazing research. I've had the great fortune of working with an exceptional team over the span of a year, and I've just been so impressed with everything you all are doing. I wrote my remarks on Mother's Day, so I actually wanted to start with a little bit of a story about my own mother. My mom arrived in the United States from India in the 1970s as a doctor. She represented her home state of Maharashtra, India, as an athlete, and during college was a model for L'Oreal. Before moving here, she had completed her residency in both obstetrics and pathology and managed to have 3 kids, all doing this, coming to the United States with a few dollars in her pocket. And when she left India, it was towards the end of Indira Gandhi's term as India's first female prime minister. She and my father, like her parents before her, had fallen in love at a party and gotten married. I offer this perhaps as a tribute to my mom, but mostly to highlight my first major takeaway, the complexity of South Asia, the region which, as with many parts of the world, does not present a monolithic portrait of women, and neither should our advocacy work on gender. On the one hand, South Asia boasts one of the richest traditions of women's leadership in the modern world, having had two of the world's first female heads of state, relatively high levels of women's political participation both in the ballot box and as elected officials, and with women serving in C-suites of some of the most innovative and competitive companies in the region. At the same time, progress in the region has had its limitations. In 2018, India's Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality, which, as many in this room will tell me, probably school me on my explanation of the Gini coefficient, 1 or 0 represents perfect equality and 100 perfect inequality. India's score was 50, with women making up the bulk of those living in poverty. The pandemic only made things worse. Women made up the bulk of the job losses and permanent business closures that India experienced. In Bangladesh, women's economic participation accounts for the country's incredible progress on poverty alleviation over the past 2 decades. This progress is not without qualifiers. A 2021 peer-reviewed study in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health found that gender-based violence, in this instance economic violence, reduced per capita income and increased income poverty and multidimensional poverty in rural Bangladesh. I'm closing out nearly 24 years, which is crazy for me, at the State Department, starting working for the first U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, Milan Verveer, and now kind of as a bookend as a senior advisor to our Assistant Secretary. And just wanted to underscore, as you all move into the world or pursue careers in foreign policy or gender specifically, the importance of nuance in approaching this work. You know, one of my favorite ambassadors, he was our former ambassador to Sri Lanka. We had to do a training for 100, first and second tour officers serving across South and Central Asia. And they invited me to speak on gender. And in the course of this training, Ambassador Kesha, he said, if you're a really good ambassador, you'll see a news story and you'll give someone a call and they'll give you a layer of complexity that you wouldn't otherwise find in the press, right? And if you're really, really good, you'll have more, local contacts and they'll give you the real scoop. And if you're an exceptional diplomat, you'll find out the truth, right? In this work of advancing gender equity or gender equality, it's really important to understand the political economy in which inequity is embedded. And one thing that I've been so impressed by in the course of this, my work with Donna, Erin, the whole team, has been their exceptional integrity around data, the exceptional focus on really looking at what the data is showing and then responding to it. Our team actually had to change focus a little bit because we weren't able to get the data, I think, from some of the sources that we were hoping. And I really appreciate it and want to underscore the importance of really letting the facts lead the way. Second, education is a lifelong pursuit. So I just want to urge everyone to stay open to new information. I know many of you are graduating probably fiercely on the job hunt, trying to get the best possible one. My experience is that the path to the job you may want may first start with one that you don't. And as cliche as it sounds, it all makes more sense in retrospect. I never planned on focusing on gender professionally. My interest was piqued while working at the World Bank, focused on economic growth and poverty alleviation after graduating from Georgetown. A friend and colleague, incidentally, a SAIS graduate, urged me to attend a keynote address, an event keynoted by Milan Verveer, who ended up becoming my boss. And it was focused on addressing gender-based violence perpetrated by bank staff against their partners, which was the first time that the bank had taken this on. And this was particularly of interest to me because growing up as a young kid from Baltimore, one of my best friend's fathers was a senior bank official, and he was very, very abusive towards my friend's mother. And I went to that event wanting to know, what is the bank doing to take this on? Because they suffered silently for years, given his position at the bank. The event transformed my perspective. It triggered a strong interest to re-examine our economic system and the role gender inequality might be playing as an externality which in economics speak, as to everyone knows here, is a cost we take as a given and for which no one wants to take responsibility. She made clear, as the United States continues to do in the Biden administration, that the windfall gains of taking responsibility through policies and laws and efforts to tackle pernicious social and cultural barriers are immense. For instance, in the United States, women's female labor force participation has nearly doubled since 1950. Because of this, our economy grew by $2 trillion. When women joined the workforce, wages actually went up for the country. And women's income now accounts for most of the increase in family income. Further efforts to close the gender gap in the economy in the United States could boost our GDP by $2 trillion, according to Fast Company. And countries abroad like Pakistan, on which I focus a great deal of my time, could increase its productivity and growth by 30%, a fact courtesy of the International Monetary Fund. These gains, and again, no secret to anyone in this room, extend to outcomes in peace and security. A UN study of 82 peace agreements in 42 armed conflicts between 1989 and 2011, for instance, found that peace agreements with women signatories are linked with more durable peace. This data lit a light bulb in me, pivoting my career, but that would not have happened if I had closed my ears to new information, remaining stuck in a plan. Jobs in international affairs are dynamic and will focus your attention on different sectors or geographies, often requiring you to work across various institutions. Remaining flexible is vital. Third, keep fostering connection in your professional relationships as you pursue your career and quest to change the world. Within a few weeks of my starting my job at the State Department, I had to staff an event with Secretary Clinton, and I remember walking into this really grand 8th floor room at the State Department. Many of you may have visited it. And it was packed with celebrities and CEOs of some of the major tech firms in the country and, in fact, world. And I honestly felt very out of place. My last job before I went to Georgetown was working with youth in inner city schools, and I literally was sleeping on a floor of a high school before I started Georgetown. So I walked into this place and felt really out of sorts, and I called a friend I had met the summer prior, who had been at the State Department in a very senior position. And Xander became my go-to dose of sunshine. We went for a walk almost every day, and he made me laugh hysterically for at least 20 minutes every single day. And that's honestly what kept me at the State Department. When I worked on the Pakistan desk, which was my job before the one that I currently hold, my colleague Aaron used to keep bubble gum on his desk. And I always asked him why he did that. And the only reason he did it, he would just bring copious amounts of bubble gum. It then turned into Nerf guns. But he wanted to have people, break the ice over something not serious and be able to connect with one another. And he was the source of that for the Pakistan desk. And it really kept us going during some really turbulent times in the bilateral relationship. Those things really matter. The happiness we gain by being connected to other people really matters. And science bears this out. In her book, The Happiness Track, my favorite psychologist and the director for Yale's Project on Emotional Intelligence, Dr. Emma Seppala, highlights the importance of positive social relationships with other people at work as a critical predictor for material success and happiness. So invest in your relationships as you pursue this academic excellence. Fourth, partnerships can be key to effectuating societal change and gender equality. I serve as the executive director, as Chiedo mentioned, of 2 public-private partnerships, the U.S.-Pakistan Women's Council and the U.S.-India Alliance for Women's Economic Empowerment. And this is something that I think actually Secretary Clinton really brought to the State Department, this idea that we really need to be involving private sector, civil society, and government as stakeholders in foreign policy. And I'm seeing this bear out again and again in the course of my work, so I really wanted to emphasize it. We launched this Pakistan Million Women Mentors initiative, for instance, right before the pandemic, wanting to reach 1 million women in Pakistan by 2025. And suddenly, companies came forward and within a few months decided that they wanted to mentor 40,000 women. And really, we saw that over the course of the pandemic, we were able to reach 9,000 women at a time when we as government were very constrained in how much we could get out and reach the audiences we would have wanted to reach. So pulling together and understanding the nature of public-private partnerships has been really key to the work that we do at the department. And I would really encourage those interested in careers in gender equality to explore that facet of the work. The last point that I want to make is the importance of finding entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial leaders working to change institutions from within in the course of your efforts. To refer back to the council, we work with US and Pakistani member companies, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Engro, GE, P&G, S&P, a number the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to foster dialogue and exchange best practices on accelerating women's economic empowerment. Identifying champions on the inside, usually at senior levels, has been really critical to stewarding efforts within these institutions. I would be remiss not to highlight my career at the State Department, which has been fundamental to translating my skills into impact, and I will share some resources with Chiedo about internship opportunities and other career opportunities at the State Department. With that, I want to thank you for inviting me to share my 2 cents on gender equality, and want to again commend the teams here. And I look forward to hearing about the work that you've been doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you so very much for that lovely remarks. And so this is part of why we do this, right? To establish links and relationships that our students then connect to, both for here and for the hereafter. We have evidence, real life evidence of that in the room today. Georgia Jewett, who was a graduate of this program a couple years ago, and from working with the clients, started a job with the clients, and then moved on to the State Department, and is now a client, right? Full circle, full circle. And so at this point, we will, we're getting ready to start the presentations. Do you want to put the seats out so that when the teams start, we don't, please? And so for this year, we have 6 teams. Each of the 6 teams working on really critical issues of global importance. And each team has worked with dedication to the projects that they have handled. They have worked with, shown a real, very high sense of professionalism and commitment to the cause of gender equality. And of course, when we talk about gender equality, right, it's equality of the sexes, but also including equality for people that typically, are positioned on the margins of the state, right? People of other minority groups who ordinarily would not get included in the core processes of state distribution of resources. And so the teams have worked on projects along the spectrum of gender equality, both for women in the private sector as well as men in the private sector in terms of mental health, down to women's political participation, specifically in Indonesia. And so we have, for the team that worked with the State Department, we have Takako Iwaki, Fang Lee, Erin McCoy, and Donna Young, and they worked on identifying gender bias in financial services, a comparative study of Sri Lanka and Kazakhstan. For the team that worked with, State Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization, State Department, we have Sophia Alpiza, Sarah Magin, Sophia Ruiz, and Michaela Tucker. For the team that worked with IRI on glass ceilings and glass nets, barriers to entry for women in subnational Indonesian elected office, we have Liv Heinrich, Leanne Holman, Kaylee Sterling, and Monica Weller. For the team that worked with IFC on the role of the private sector in supporting mental health and well-being in emerging markets, case studies of Bangladesh and Indonesia, we have Abby Christopher, Bianca Jetzel, Alexa Lowe, and Sarah Priano. For the team that worked with Women Deliver on global assessment of unpaid care work and case study in Rwanda, we have Sining Lee, Mo Print, Few, Hayden Smith, and Ziting Wang. For the team that worked with CGID on the impact of climate change on women in northern Nigeria in agricultural value chains, we have Uzra Azizi, Alisa Indek, Chuyi Liu, and Hilia Peng. Each team will present for 10 minutes. By the time the 6 teams have presented, we'll have a response from our very own Professor Sarah Jordan, who is here, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers, and then after that, lunch. And so at this point, I have the pleasure of inviting the first team up to the podium.
I can't sleep. I am afraid of being raped. I fear for my children's future. These quotes are 3 of many fears women shared with us during our focus group discussions. And despite this suffering, women are often excluded from early warning and early response efforts in their conflicting communities. Therefore, we have partnered with the Bureau in Conflict Stabilization Operations to research women's inclusion in early warning and early response efforts in northern Nigeria. This presentation will cover our research process, our findings, and our recommendations for the Bureau.
Our research focused on north central and northwest Nigeria. When people think of violence in northern Nigeria, they tend to think of violence in northeast Nigeria, generally Boko Haram, but what we found from our data collection in the Kaduna and Plateau states was that the taxonomies of violence were quite different. One kind of violence is conflict between farmers and herders, where primarily Christian farmers and primarily Muslim Fulani herders are in conflict for the same water and land resources necessary to support their livelihoods. This in turn feeds into interreligious conflict between Christians and Muslims. And there's also banditry, where groups of young men roam generally rural areas and engage in criminality like extortion and kidnapping for ransom. So how can Ewer interventions help? Along the cycle of conflict, there's a few different points where interventions can be put in place. There's a time of rising tension, which sometimes leads to an outbreak of violence. And then in the aftermath, there's insecurity, which can in turn reinforce tensions and conflict. So Ewer systems can target rising tensions, so the conflict at the beginning. Early warning systems can detect tensions between communities and ensure that peace builders and community leaders are reducing tensions and supporting communities and finding peaceful solutions. In the case that there is an attack or outbreak, early notification systems can ensure that communities nearby have the information they need to protect themselves and their families. And in the case of victims who have experienced an attack, early responders can support them after they've lost loved ones, lost property, livelihoods, or been victims of gender-based violence.
So our research aimed to answer 3 key questions. The first of which is what are women's unique needs in these environments that are prone to conflict? Also, how can women be included in Ewer responses and how they can take leadership roles, as well as understanding what the community's perspective is on including women in Ewer programming. To do this, we had 3 research methods. The first was a literature review. The second was a key informant interview in which we interviewed people in the field, either practitioners or academics. And the other was a focus group discussions. These were split between age and also gender. So we had groups of women and men ages 18 to 40 and 41 to 60. We also had one group of mixed gender early responders. And we did this to see if there were major discrepancies between these groups based on their demographic and their experiences.
As stated earlier, a key component of our methodology was an in-depth literature review. We surveyed a broad range of peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed sources in order to ensure our understanding of the taxonomies of violence in northern Nigeria, as was discussed earlier, but also generally what are the barriers to and advantages of women's participation in early warning and early response. And what the literature showed is that women generally face real structural and social barriers. This is due to a lack of accessibility and community perception. So women are not necessarily seen as stakeholders in response mechanisms, and many times they're excluded from formal Ewer systems. When looking at the advantages, the literature showed that when women participate in Ewer, it allows for the inclusion of vital perspectives. The literature emphasized that women are many times the first to recognize or witness changes or early signs of violence in their homes and communities. Additionally, the literature illustrates that when women participate, it results in positive consequences for peace and stability.
Our focus group discussions gave us key insights into the lives of women living in conflict in northern Nigeria. During our discussions, we asked participants to describe the level of security in their communities. Overall, all participants stated that their communities and neighboring communities were highly insecure, as they fear for their lives, for their livestock, for their homes, for their children, because kidnappings, murder, and rape are rampant. Then we asked them what type of response happens whenever there is a violent event taking place. They said that state response is incredibly poor, because the state lacks the mechanisms and tools to appropriately respond to violence. They also stated that notification is incredibly delayed. It could take up to 15 minutes for them to find out that something happened, and sometimes they're not notified at all. And the only way they know violence is taking place is because they heard screaming or gunshots. The participants also revealed that they have taken on security for their communities as their own job. Therefore, they developed vigilante groups composed of elderly men and young men. Because of the lack of state response, they now believe the security of their communities is their own responsibility. During our key informant interviews, an informant shared a really important story with us. She told us that you will see maybe 4 to 5 middle-aged women with several children that are not their own. In this time, she asked the woman, "Are these your children?" And the woman said, "We picked this one off the dead. The mom was dead, so I grabbed them and ran." Then she was asked about another child, and she said, "Oh, my neighbor was killed, so I grabbed them and ran." Then when asked about the last child, she said, "We found them wandering in the bush." They had been in the bush for 3 days. The key informant explained that these women take these kids and deny themselves food as well as medical attention. They don't even know the names of these children, yet they prioritize them. This story is key for us to understand the important role women play on the sidelines in conflict response and how important they are in protecting the greatest victims of violence.
In terms of our findings for women's participation in Ewer in northern Nigeria, our research found that much like the literature review illustrated, women in northern Nigeria face structural and social barriers to their participation. One barrier is due to a lack of accessibility to formal Ewer systems. So for example, cultural restrictions on mobility or access to public spaces like local community and council meetings, on top of lower literacy and education rates, results in the ignoring of their challenges and viable solutions to these challenges. It also results in the ignoring of the viable solutions that women can bring to alleviating conflict in their communities. Additional barriers are community perceptions and self-perception. So at a community level in northern Nigeria, women are not necessarily being seen as key stakeholders in response mechanisms. And many times they themselves do not feel empowered or comfortable enough to speak up when they do witness early signs of violence. Our last barrier our research highlights is about women being undervalued by their male colleagues. All of our female first responders in our focus groups discuss one of their biggest challenges has been not being taken seriously by their male colleagues. So whether this is being underestimated or taken for granted or having their ability to perform their jobs questioned. When looking at the advantages, our research found that women in northern Nigeria have very strong information networks. This allows them to gather and share information very successfully. And many of our respondents said this is due to the fact that they are women and their connection to other women, as well as their vast social networks. Additionally, research shows that when women participate in Ewer, it results in the inclusion of key stakeholders and response mechanisms. And lastly, research shows that when women participate in Ewer, they advocate for other women and youth to participate as well. Many of our respondents said that they use their their position to empower other youth and women to speak up when there's early signs of violence and to be agents of change.
So through our research methods, we came up with 4 key recommendations. The first of which is that it's necessary to seek buy-in from community leaders to incorporate women fully into Ewer's programming. The second is we also need gender-specific program for early response systems, preferably at the start of creating these systems. The third is that we need to support capacity building for women in Ewer forums. And the fourth is it's necessary to improve access to telecommunications technology in order to mitigate the issue of getting notified about violent events as they occur after the fact and help alleviate some of that stress. So thank you all for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you more during the Q&A.
I'll just let it. Just need to find, I can't see.
So our team will discuss with you the impact of climate change on female farmers in Ghana and Nigeria. We know that in West Africa, agriculture accounts for 65% of employment. In Ghana, 41% of farmers are women, and in Nigeria, 75% of farmers are women. But before we dig deeper into our key recommendations and findings, we would like to walk you through a female farmer's day-to-day life. On average, she's a mother to 4 children. She's a caregiver and a caretaker responsible for the children and elderly in her household. She also cooks, cleans, and brings clean drinking water home. Besides fulfilling her traditional responsibilities, she also provides for her family. So she works long hours in her field. She does not have access to modern irrigation techniques, so she uses traditional methods. When her produce is ready, she must take it to the nearby farmer's market to sell it. But once there, she is responsible to sell everything she brought. Why? Because she does not have access to storage to keep the remaining produce to sell it at another time. So what does this have to do with climate change? We know that in West Africa, climate change is causing massive land degradation, desertification, droughts, floods, and bringing unpredictable rainfall patterns. And all of this is making it extremely challenging for farmers to plan ahead and decide what to grow and when to grow it. We also know that the climate crisis is magnifying gender inequities, including economic marginalization and food insecurity in rural areas where a majority of these farmers live and work. So their existing agriculture systems and methods are making it extremely difficult for them, and they're unsustainable in the long term. And that's exactly the motivation for our research. How is climate change impacting female farmers in Ghana and Nigeria? For our research, we partnered with the Center for Journalism, Innovation, and Development. They're an investigative journalism NGO headquartered in Abuja, Nigeria. And through their work, they promote fundamental human rights, good governance, and accountability in West Africa. The CJID will use key recommendations in our report to advocate for female farmers and address the challenges we have identified.
So in terms of methodology, we applied a mixed method approach. For quantitative method, we conducted a climate knowledge survey. For qualitative method, we had interviews and focus group discussions. Regarding study areas, we focused on Ashanti, Central, and Volta regions of Ghana, Anambra, Akwa Ibom, Federal Capital Territory, Lagos, and the urban states of Nigeria, with a particular focus on rural areas. And our sample size is 275 individuals from both Ghana and Nigeria. First, we conducted total 24 of KIIs across academics, government officials, and representatives from 117 DIIs with female farmers, and they are also the participants of our climate knowledge surveys. And finally, we conducted a total of 15 focus group discussions with both female and male farmers. And before we dig deeper into the key findings, we would like to read you a quote from one of our interviewees, which captures the issues in detail. She said, "Storage costs are high and we have bad roads. It is headache for female farmers to get yield to bigger markets for higher market shares. They mostly sell their crops to men at lower prices to avoid having to figure out how to get bigger markets. However, in the process, they lost a huge share of the profit because men sell the same crops at higher prices." So according to all the key informants and most FGD participants from Ghana, access to credit or financial assistance was identified as one of the biggest challenges for female farmers in Ghana. In addition, based on KIIs and the results from DII's demographic surveys, especially the question about the number of children, we found that female farmers are also facing the issue of double burden of time. And finally, there are also other challenges from agriculture and climate aspects, such as lack of technical ability and the irregular rain patterns.
As we look into the key findings we have in Nigeria, we also identified 4 focus areas as similar to Ghana. So the primary issue stands out is the lack of access to financing for female farmers when they ask for loans and credit from banks. And the major reason behind that is the lack of collateral for banks to provide such services. And at the same time, there's the lack of access to agriculture training, education, and technology as compared to their male peers. And also, when there are programs designed for climate change adaptation that are not necessarily provided for female farmers as well, there's also a huge policy enforcement gap between the federal level policy designs and the community level policy enforcement. We also find that there is a lack of adequate procedures against physical violence against female farmers. And as a result, we see underproductivity in the agriculture sector under climate change.
Our recommendations reflect the results of our key findings and our desk research. We asked our DII participants in Ghana, what do you believe will help you adapt to climate change? The top 2 answers were financial assistance and new varieties of climate-resistant crops. Thus, our recommendations to the CJID in Ghana are to implement the Alliance for Financial Inclusion's General Action Plan, to decrease the gender gap in financial inclusion, and increase the number of female farmers with access to affordable financial services. Second, to mitigate the social inequity imposed by the double burden of time, we recommend the government provide funding for the construction, management, and teacher training of daycare centers. Third, we recommend the government invest in windbreaks and flood barriers to mitigate extreme climate change effects, particularly to affect crops and nutrients held in the top layer of soil. And finally, for Ghana, we recommend the government increased investment into the Ghana Enterprise Agency to support local technology companies in developing climate-smart technologies for agriculture. According to our research in Nigeria, the top 2 areas in which female farmers needed help were financial assistance and climate-resistant crops. Thus, our recommendations in Nigeria are to increase investment into the National Agricultural Extension Services, to restore extension services in rural areas, to increase the number of female farmers with access to technical training, education, climate-resilient crops, and diversified seedlings. Second, we recommend the creation of a monitoring and evaluation plan to ensure the implementation of the General Action Plan to increase the number of female farmers in Nigeria with access to affordable financial services. Third, we recommend improving microcredit intermediation through the National Finance Cooperative to increase the number of female farmers with access to microcredit services. And finally, we recommend that the government invest further into the biotechnology sector through the Biotechnology Development Agency to increase access to agricultural technologies for female farmers.
Based on our findings, we list out 4 areas we want to see further research progress on. So first, while our key informants identified problem burden time, this is not necessarily recognized by the female farmers themselves. So you want to see research on the reasons behind the awareness gap in future research. And second, we find that there's lack of adequate research on the climate change impact on female farmers' health, as well as in-depth research on selected areas beyond the scope of our research in the two countries. Finally, we want to see further research on the gendered and physical violence against female farmers and females in general, which is beyond scope of our research, but we identify it as a severe question that needs further research on.
While our key findings and recommendations were country-specific, our research reflects a broader need to implement gender-sensitive policies and frameworks into the government and private sector. Female farmers are the backbone of the agricultural economy in Nigeria and Ghana, and as climate change worsens and food insecurity increases, it is imperative that the government implement policies that support and uplift female farmers for the safety and security for all. Thank you.
I would first like to set the scene. Unpaid care work is often invisible. It's invisible because it's usually understood as taking care of the sick, cooking a meal, or changing a diaper. The International Labor Organization defines unpaid care work as care work that is provided without monetary reward by unpaid carers. Yet, unpaid care work carries significant value. Per year, unpaid care work equates to 16.4 billion hours worked. That is the equivalent of 2 billion people working 8 hours a day without pay. Globally, this is valued at $10 trillion, $800 billion per year worth of work if we were to count it in the GDP. 76% of care work falls on women and girls. 265 minutes for women and girls compared to 83 minutes for men. That is almost 5 hours compared to an hour and a half. Permundo projects that it'll take 92 years for the burden to be shared equally among men and women. Unpaid care work presents significant challenges in terms of gender equality, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and economic mobility for women and girls. The pandemic has exacerbated that. The 2.1. 2.1 is the ratio of women to men out of work because of the pandemic, with women carrying an additional 5.2 hours for women and girls compared to 3.5 hours for men. Today we're going to present our global assessment of unpaid care work with a specific case study in Rwanda with our partners Women Deliver. Women Deliver is a leading global advocate for women and girls, promoting gender equality and the health and rights of women and girls in all their intersecting identities. To kind of frame this, we want to propose the 3 R's, coined first by Diane Elson. The 3 R's is to recognize unpaid care work, to reduce unpaid care work, and then to redistribute unpaid care work. I'm going to tell you why this is important. This is important because when we look at policies that are the most effective at alleviating the burden of unpaid care work, we want to make sure that they fit all 3 of these. So that is the framework that we used in our compendium. Our main research question: what are the impacts of best practices for addressing the burden of unpaid care work in Rwanda? To do this, we conducted a literature review, key informant interviews with over 13 NGOs from Rwanda and international organizations, and extensive desk research of best practices, delivering 11 best practices from a global level to a micro level to Women Deliver in the form of a compendium.
With our 3R framework, recognize, reduce, and redistribute, we do our data analysis and desk research. First, on the recognize part, we have 2 key findings. We first found raising awareness is essential to recognize the unpaid care burden of women. Sometimes women do not actually think they are actually working and contributing to the society. As one of our interviewees stated, when you ask women, they just say they are jobless. Second, we found reframing the narrative be also crucial to recognize the unpaid care burden. Different values, culture, and religious beliefs and norms sometimes restrict the rights of women and other vulnerable groups. Social norms and stereotypes reinforce the impression that it is women's responsibility to share more unpaid care burdens. Under the reduced catalog, we first found that technology such as accessible electricity and reliable transportation can help women reduce their time spent on washing and cooking. One of our interviewees identified that women are doing really tiring and backbreaking work. Second, we found that resources such as affordable care centers can help women reduce their time spent on caring their children and open more space and energy for business opportunities. One of our respondents said, having a place to drop the keys for women is fantastic for their ability to engage in more productive activities. Thirdly, we found that putting women in groups can help women express themselves, help each other, and increase their bargaining power to a more equal resource allocation. One of our respondents emphasized the importance of cooperative strategy, that women can gain more powers when they are come together as a group. Third, under the redistribute part, to redistribute the unpaid care burden from household to government and society, to redistribute the burden from women to men, we should never ignore male engagement to a more equal unpaid care burden share. One of our respondents identified that parents should split work between girls and boys to encourage boys to help their sisters. And partnership with SAIS also is essential to advocacy effectively. One of our respondents said it's important to avoid the parachute approach in international intervention of unpaid care work, because grassroots NGOs have extensive knowledge in local conditions, and they can share experience in working with local people.
So as our deep dive case study analysis, we look into what work has already been done in Rwanda to address the burden of care work. Tying back to the 3 Rs, we found that local NGOs and the government have also been working in these themes we came across in our key findings as well. First, under Recognize, we found that ActionAid Rwanda led a national level research to address the data collection to raise awareness for the unpaid care work. In terms of government, the Ministry of Family Planning and Gender included unpaid care work in its 2021 revised gender policy. Under Reduce, local NGOs like Haguruka is providing free legal aid services to expand women's access to resources. And Oxfam provided innovative biogas stoves to reduce the time women spend on collecting firework. Promando's program P and H work on male engagement as an intervention to redistribute care work at home. Finally, Education Development Center is providing job skills training to junior caregivers.
Despite the abundance of good programs, our team also identified gaps in existing research and practices. For instance, in the short term, there exists a lack of local data collection prior to implementation of programs, and some NGOs still treat women as a homogeneous group. In the medium term, there's a lack of impact tracking to know which programs has worked and which hasn't worked. And there's also a lack of capacity training and human resource development of some of the NGOs. In the long term, there's a gap in implementation, and there's a lack of advocacy targeting the intersection between unpaid care work and sexual and reproductive health and rights. Where the future lies for unpaid care work? Well, there's a role for each stakeholder to play. The governments are responsible for implementing policies and developing infrastructures like childcare center. And NGOs should take initiative in advocacy and influencing not only the government, the community, but also other fellow NGOs. Local communities is where change happens, and they should play the role of cultivating male role models and building networks of women. Addressing unpaid care work is not an easy job. It is truly a collective mission that requires global cooperation, incessant commitment, and long-term dedication. It is also a highly context-based issue that requires knowledge of nuances on the ground and constant evaluation and re-evaluation of local programs. We hope our study can shed light on the issue, and we hope the audiences can leave the room knowing at least three things. First, women and girls do disproportionately more unpaid care work than men and boys globally. And secondly, the 3R framework, which is recognizing, reducing, and redistributing that helps to address the issue. And lastly, there exists a number of best practices, but there are also gaps that need to be addressed in order to better tackle the issue in the future. And there's a role for each of us to play. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Hello. Testing. In 1999, Indonesia experienced the first democratic election in its history. This was the culmination of a year-long movement. This was the combination of a year-long movement to oust the dictator Suharto and to institute a democratic government in Indonesia. This democratic transition was remarkable, but incomplete. The political party system is marked by elite capture and corruption in Indonesia today, and women continue to underperform in that system. As such, international NGOs like IRI have stepped in to try and rectify that unbalance and encourage women to participate more fully in the political system. So we are partnered in this project with IRI, which stands for the International Republican Institute. They are a DC-based NGO that operates in over 100 countries, focused on advancing democracy. They work with different partners in different areas, including, in Indonesia specifically, civil society, parties, and government. And in Indonesia, they run a program called the Emerging Leaders Academy. This is a training program for young political candidates or aspiring political candidates from marginalized or underrepresented groups with the aim to increase their political capacity. They currently run programs in 5 provinces, with programs opening newly in Maluku and East Nusa Tenggara. Our study has focused on 3 provinces. We chose Maluku and East Nusa Tenggara because they are new provinces, because they are different than much of Indonesia. They're very remote and more prominently Christian. And then we also chose North Sumatra to have a baseline of a more established program, a more centrally located province, and a more Muslim majority program. Our research question is focused on what are the barriers that prevent women from achieving office in Indonesia. The legislature of Indonesia, the DPRD, is only 20.7% female, despite the fact that Indonesia has a quota system that says that 30% of candidates on the ballot must be female. So why are these women not succeeding? Most of the existing research has focused on the national level. However, we found that the characteristics that mark the national versus provincial level, provincial or sub-provincial, are very different. So our research is focused on the provincial and sub-provincial level to understand what obstacles do women face at those early stages that prevent them from continuing. In essence, our research question is what factors keep women from achieving office and why? And then second, how can ELA training help rectify those issues?
Thank you so much. I'm going to cover the quantitative section of our research. We conducted a survey with 99 participants, of which the majority was ELA participants. Slightly more than half were men. And we asked them general questions about their religion, their family, their income, their education, their place of residency, and so on and so forth. And we're looking at how do these factors correlate with where those people are in their political career. So we had some participants who did not intend to run for office in the future, some who did intend to run for office, some who had already run and lost, and some who had already run and won. So out of all of this, we made 2 regressions, one with the dependent variable being the intention to run in the future, and one with the dependent variable being the success in running. For the intention to run, we found that gender was significant and women were much more likely to run for office in the future than men. Age was significant in the sense that the older candidates were the more likely they were to have the intention to run for office. ELA training was significant where we are not sure what the correlation is, if ELA training motivates people or if motivated people do ELA training. And nationwide religion did not matter, but in the regions of Maluku and ENT, Eastern Nusa Tenggara, religion did matter, which was interesting because they are Christian majority, like Katie already said, and Christians overall in Maluku were more motivated to run for office than Muslims, and in East Nusa Tenggara, Catholics were specifically having the intention to run for office in the future. For success, we found that marriage status was very important. Married people were more likely to have success running in the elections than non-married people, which related with a lot of our qualitative research where participants had said that there were rumors about non-married people or that they kind of found it harder to campaign without a man by their side. And nationwide religion was important, especially Catholics had a much higher chance at political success than non-Catholics. And this is likely related to the power of networks, which Monica and Leanne are going to elaborate on.
So speaking to the qualitative side, so we interviewed 7 experts from academia, civil society, and government, and 15 candidates, 5 each from Maluku, North Sumatra, and East Nusa Tenggara. We also followed this up with 3 focus groups, 1 in each region. And then we had 4 main findings in terms of our qualitative data. The first one was IRR training. Overall, women found that IRR training was very helpful in terms of self-promotion, in terms of building up a campaign image, and working in male-dominated spaces. However, they really wanted to see more work specifically focused on rural, low-tech approaches, as well as how to better work with other female candidates running for office. In terms of gender issues, women tended to focus on a broad campaign of women and children's issues, which may have cut them off from potential voters and constituents that weren't as interested in those general areas, although a few did focus on literacy and environmental campaigns. Additionally, many women felt tokenized by the quota system. Rather than political party leadership taking them seriously, they were just there to fill a ballot spot, and they wanted to be taken seriously. In terms of the power of networks, just like with any society, personal networks were very powerful, whether it was their ethnic, hometown, or religious networks. Their religious congregations could serve as a base from which they had voters and constituents, as well as for people who had familial ties to political parties, it was much easier for them to get into the political system just because they had that greater knowledge. And in terms of resources, due to the gender pay gap and other inequalities, women were less likely to have financial and material goods. This was very critical because these campaigns were largely self-financed, and so they had to ask family and friends for loans and other materials, either from posters, transportation costs, to even getting access to printers. This was very difficult because voters expect candidates to provide them material goods. So without this, they were less likely to get voters, and so that inhibited many female candidates. And then this kind of leads into electoral system problems. At least 1 in 3 voters in Indonesia is bribed during an election. And so if you don't have these political, financial, and social resources, you are less likely to do this. Thus, women are disadvantaged, particularly in comparison to incumbent male politicians. This leads into witness buying as well. So witnesses are individuals that are
supported by a party to help oversee vote counting and ensure election accountability. However, many of these witnesses are also vulnerable to manipulation and bribery from political officials and incumbent politicians who want to remain in power, who are then, again, usually male. And so for many women, they didn't understand the nuances of this system and they didn't realize kind of what into it. So they felt that they didn't know about it and also felt disillusioned after their first election.
Alrighty, and with that, we'll go on to our recommendations. So we structured our recommendations specifically on what IRI can do through their ELA programming. The first big recommendation we have, which you've heard a lot about today, is the network training. So IRI can train their candidates on how to leverage the existing networks that they have, specifically religious networks or even school networks. The second recommendation we have is election witness coordination and training. So a lot of our survey participants weren't aware of the vote stealing process, which dealt with lots of misattributed votes. So the ELA training can help with understanding the process of becoming an official witness or an unofficial witness and what the vote counting process actually looks like. The third big recommendation we have is canvassing and polling for women's issues, because the participants who did run a campaign mainly campaigned on women's issues like literacy or environmental issues. We think that polling specific regions and understanding what would be important or vital for motivating factors in a campaign would be something that IRI can do. Campaign and fundraising and finance training. So understanding finance allocation, how to financially run a campaign is something that the ELA training can do, as well as making it specific to each region. Finally, party coordination. So encourage women based on their merits, because 1/3 of candidates are, due to the gender quota system, we think that helping women understand that their campaign can be based on their own merits would be very beneficial. And for them to be not just a woman's candidate, but a candidate who happens to be a woman is very important. And with that, we thank you so much, and we look forward to talking during the Q&A with you. As a side note, somebody left their cell phone up here, so you are missing.
Okay, so today we are going to be discussing women's financial inclusion in South and Central Asia. We had the privilege of working with Mudika and the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs on this project. So we conducted a comparative study of Sri Lanka and Kazakhstan. We chose these countries, one, based off their geographical location, being in South and Central Asia, and also because of their unique differences in their financial sectors. So Sri Lanka has a relatively new credit scoring system called the CRIB system. It was founded in 2020, whereas Kazakhstan has a more developed financial services industry that has been around since the early 2000s. Also, based on gender, Sri Lanka has more educated women than men in the country. However, this is not transferring over to employment. They still have declining female labor force participation. Whereas Kazakhstan has government policies in place that fight gender equality. However, there are still barriers to women's economic participation, specifically in rural areas. So our research question was, how can we mitigate gender bias in financial institutions and promote financial inclusion? We did this through a mixed methods approach using both quantitative and qualitative data. For our quantitative data, we used survey research in Colombo, Sri Lanka. This map shows the 9 public marketplaces that we surveyed. We had a total of 239 surveys, with 131 being men and 130 being women. We obtained responses on their experience with financial services. Our questions included, do you own a bank account? Have you ever applied for a loan? And if so, have you been rejected? Then we ran an analysis using statistical tests to determine gender differences. For our qualitative section, we conducted key informant interviews.
We conducted 7 in Sri Lanka and 4 in Kazakhstan. We interviewed academics, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and bankers in the financial sector. And then we conducted keyword analysis on interview transcripts, pulling out the main themes that were prevalent in both countries.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the limitation that we faced during our research. So first limitation is a survey location. We were not able to conduct a survey in Kazakhstan because of the political unrest during our research. So we only conducted a survey in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, which is the largest city in the country. So we didn't collect information from the other side of the country. So we can't generalize our findings into the entire countries. The next limitation is a language. Although we prepared surveys in different local languages, it was a little bit hard for us to ask local people to join our surveys because some of the people didn't speak English at all, so it was a little bit difficult to ask them to participate in a survey. And the last limitation is a sample size. We ended up collecting over 200 responses from our surveys, but we were not able to establish statistical significance because of a limited sample size. So moving on to our findings. So during our survey, we asked their experience in financial services. So the left chart shows their account ownership, bank account ownership. As you can see, more than 90% of both women and men have access to bank account, and there's not huge gender gap in the access to bank account. And on the right side shows have you ever applied loan in the past? And as you can see, about 30% of male have applied a loan in the past, while only 25% of female applied a loan in the past. So there is slightly gender gap between in a loan application experiences. But as I explained before, we were not able to establish the statistical significance because of the limited sample size. And moving on to the next slide. So we also asked the financial knowledge. So the left side chart shows the knowledge about credit scoring system. So we asked if they know about credit scoring system in the countries. And as you can see, only 25% of people is aware of credit scoring system in the countries. And on the right-hand side shows the relationship between education. And as you can see, more educated people are more likely to aware of credit scoring system. In that sense, we can say that we need to promote financial literacy so that they are aware of the credit scoring system to get access to finance.
And we also found that, in general, the public transportation in Sri Lanka is inconvenient, so women have to find jobs that near their home. And we also noticed that social violence has worsened in the financial conclusion in the past 2 years, and which has a negative impact on women's economic empowerment. And in terms of financial institutions, we found that in general there are less women applicants because they have had lower average salaries, and the low application is tedious, so which made it difficult for resource-poor applicants to apply for financial loans. In general, people are not very familiar with the concept of credit scoring systems, and in banking sector there were less female bankers. In terms of COVID-19 issues, and Sri Lanka has experienced sharp economic contraction since 2020. Especially in the tourist sector. However, from the banking side, there are lack of policy resilience to support the small and medium enterprises. Next slide. In terms of the KII findings in Kazakhstan, we found that social cultural norms, regional differences, and financial literacy are the key indicators. In terms of social cultural norms in general, women after marriage, they are required to fully responsible for unpaid care work in their families. In addition to that, they also often need permission from their husband to access to financial loans. And although mobile banking is widely used in Kazakhstan for apply for financial loans, we found that in rural areas, there's still limited access to finance and mobile banking. In terms of financial literacy, although the credit history report is easily to access in Kazakhstan, however, not many people are familiar with that. And we also found that in rural areas, there's lack of knowledge on basic financial services.
In this section, we will explore policy recommendations. Based on our findings in Sri Lanka, what we found is that two most important factors are present in terms of blocking women's access to financial services. One is financial education, and the other is mobility, which is why our first recommendation deals with the problem of mobility, including building safe and more comfortable transportation for women to get to and from work sites so that it reduces the risk of them being exposed to sexual assaults or harassment in public transport. Our second and third recommendations deal with financial education to develop more training and mentorship programs for women to arm them with the necessary financial knowledge to participate in the financial industry. We also recommend to integrate financial education as a part of Sri Lanka national curriculum so that women have a more equal access to finance. In Kazakhstan, we observe that the two most prevalent obstacles are, one, that there is considerable regional differences. There is a difference in terms of access between rural women and metropolitan populations, which is why our first recommendation deal with building programs to empower women specifically in rural areas, and to arm them with the necessary financial knowledge. And we also stress the importance of building a social network of women entrepreneurs and financial officers so that it facilitates an inter-regional dialogues. We also emphasize the importance of building interinstitutional partnerships and private-public partnerships in implementing such programs because it prevents the duplication of resources. Overall, our research highlighted that there is a growing financial sector in both Sri Lanka and Kazakhstan, and more women are becoming more interested in contributing to the local financial industry. However, challenges remain that the most prevalent obstacles remain sociocultural norms, lack of mobility, and lack of financial education. Now, during the course of our research, we have had the pleasure to meet with many outstanding female leaders in male-dominated industries. And these female leaders told us that if the barriers we identified in our research are removed, then women can contribute significantly more to their country's financial industry. The road to financial inclusion is a long one, but we hope our research contributes to the discussion. Thank you.
Hello? Okay. Hi, everyone. So just to begin, COVID has brought us many lessons. First and foremost, mental health is a policy priority. International organizations have also noticed this, and our work with the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector wing of the World Bank, has been a scoping exercise to understand how we can integrate and scale up mental health in emerging economies. Myself, Sahar, and Bianca, we focused on the case study of Bangladesh, while my colleagues Abby and Alexa focused on Indonesia. The subsequent slides are going to focus on the different aspects of our title here, the business case for gender-sensitive, employer-supported mental health care.
So why is mental health important? It's important because it's fundamental to our quality of life. Good mental health is essential to our physical health, our relationships, our education, our employment, and achieving our potential. There is no health without mental health. And the WHO defines mental health as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her abilities and can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and make a contribution to his or her communities. So mental health is not a binary state between those with conditions and those without. Rather, mental health exists on a continuum ranging from good mental health to severe symptoms such as chronic depressive orders. This research focuses on non-clinical conditions that can be addressed in the workplace.
Okay, so why specifically did we focus on the business case for employers in emerging markets? As Alexa mentioned, mental health is a problem everywhere, but 4 out of 5 people with mental health conditions both work and reside in low and middle income countries, creating these as a perfect target. In addition, these countries are where a large proportion of low-skilled labor is concentrated, meaning that they have higher incidences of mental health conditions specifically. So moving from that, why did we focus on the workplace? Because workplace has adverse impacts and leads to stressors that affect mental health. As a systemic level, unequal hiring processes can lead to worsened health outcomes, and at the individual level, financial consequences and job insecurity can do the exact same. So another step further, then why did we focus on the private sector specifically? First off, less than 1/5 of the world's mental health resources are provided by low middle income countries. Governments worldwide neglect this in their budgets. In these countries, it only is 0.5% of their health budgets, and a huge share of that only goes to hospitals, not general care. So with the extent of the treatment gap being as large as it is in these countries, it creates a perfect point for the private sector to enter and begin creating a market that can drive down the price and increase both the service and quality, the quality and quantity of services. There we go.
So what are gender-sensitive services? These are services that are informed by an understanding of how mental health impacts people of different genders. And why are we focusing on gender-sensitive services? It's because these services understand the differing impacts, and women are at risk for different gender-based factors, including responsibility of care. Family caregivers are more at a higher risk of developing mental health conditions. And this graph here shows the difference in female and male increase in caretaking responsibilities during COVID-19. And it shows that South and Southeast Asia have the highest increase, further capitulating the importance of our research. And while our study focuses mainly on cisgender women, further research needs to occur on trans and non-binary communities.
So to take a step back on how we conducted all of this research, our methodology consisted first off of a literature review like many other groups that was, however, for us, comprehensive of emerging markets in general. After we delivered this to the World Bank and got feedback from economists and researchers, we began dividing in the Bangladesh and Indonesia team. Hereby, we conducted data analysis of the mental health burden of disease in both countries based on WHO data and conducted key informant interviews. Based on these, we were able to create case studies with employers that then informed our best practices. Very briefly, the 2 sectors that we focused on were the garment sector in Indonesia and the ICT sector, and these both have individual reasons why we chose them, but the main for both is that both of these are vital to the economy, employ a lot of women, and are increasing their jobs in disproportionate amounts to other sectors in the coming years.
So the principal answer to our question, why scale up mental health care, specifically gender-sensitive mental health care within Bangladesh and Indonesia, which is our 2 case studies that kind of embody emerging economies for the IFC, is basically that a healthier, happier workplace is going to lead to economic prosperity. And zooming in a little bit more on what that means in boosting productivity, it means less workdays lost, better performances because people are happier and they feel secure within their workplaces. Also, lower lower turnover. And then again, specifically within what we learned in our case studies, in Bangladesh, you can see in this figure here, a graph of out-migration throughout the last few years, which is increasing exponentially because women, and this is specifically a graph of female out-migrants, they're looking not only for better economic opportunities abroad, but also healthier workplaces that imbue less job insecurity and less mental health strains. And so it kind of all together, you know, we need to increase productivity within Bangladesh, but also increase the market value of those firms within the country. And that was our principal argument, not only in Bangladesh, but in Indonesia.
And so in our research, we found key challenges that the private sector will face in both countries, which we've divided into supply and demand factors. So in supply, both countries have a relatively weak HR capacity in that some companies don't even have an HR department, and even if they do, HR representatives might not have the ability to enforce policies that impact their employees' mental health. And then on the demand side, challenges like the misunderstanding of productivity losses hinders employees from seeking mental health solutions.
So based on our findings, we developed three major recommendations to the IFC. First one is we identified key partners and, for example, NGOs and foundations tackling mental health. They can help bridge the treatment gap and improve the accessibility of mental health care. And also, trade unions can incorporate mental health into their work agenda and emphasize good mental health and well-being in the workplace.
So while we found many best practices, we're just going to highlight two for the purposes of this presentation. In Indonesia, one service provider that exemplifies best practice is Yayasan Puli, which is an NGO that partners with private sector organizations to help them plan interventions that are based on company needs. And so the services they provide are workshops on mental health, education, stigma reduction, and combating violence against women. And they provide affordable counseling for on-site and online counseling.
Instead, in Bangladesh, we looked at Manar Bundu, which was the first service provider to actually tackle the garment sector. They are working in over 60 factories in the countries across 18,000 women within those. And they set up a 5-step sustainable business model in order to do this. And the key highlights is they have things like a sports and yoga studio, as well as a beautification corner. And they're offering these services at a really low cost for women to go and take up relative to the market price. So the funds that they receive from services like this can help fund the larger mental health program that then delivers what is most needed and requested, which is counseling and one-to-one service. And in addition to that, mental health insurance cards at a very, very low cost for these people. So by doing this, they've been able to expand their model and are looking now to recreate the same thing across a garment factories in the country.
So our last recommendation is really about strengthening this business case going forward for the IFC. What we found within broader literature that covers the globe is that there's a really strong linear relationship between expanding treatment care and expanding productivity within a country's specific context. However, these numbers are specific a lot to higher income countries, specifically the US or Australia or Japan. And what we found from our KIIs is that they're frustrated not being able to bring these numbers to the service or to the firms within country and show them quantifiably how scaling up mental health care could be a benefit for them and their bottom line. And so what we need and what we suppose to the IFC is national statistics on healthcare and also on the losses that they could recuperate due to scaling up mental health care programming. And we need not only that, but also gender disaggregated models to highlight the benefits that we could have on gender sensitive approaches within these places. The IFC is definitely capable of doing this, scaling up data collection and then inputting it with our economists into an economic model that could be then used as further rationale. And so just in summary, throughout our research, which was a scoping exercise, we were able to illuminate kind of key arguments and key challenges for the IFC best practices, as well as show them how they could further strengthen this business case as they expand efforts to scale up mental health care within Bangladesh and Indonesia. Thanks.
obvious to everybody here, the amount of work that these teams have put in and the level of professionalism here. So when I speak with clients, I often say that this is a quasi-consultancy, right? Quasi only because you don't get to pay what you pay, the huge amount you pay to consultants, for this job. And so we have the pleasure of having with us to respond to the presentations, Dr. Sarah Marie Jordan, our very own. She's an assistant professor at the School of Advanced International Studies in the Development, Climate and Sustainability Program and the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering here at SAIS. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on life cycle assessment, techno-economic analysis, and technology innovation. She publishes research on solutions for a more sustainable energy future. Her publications have appeared in journals such as Nature Energy, Nature Climate Change, Science, Environmental Science and Technology, and Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews. Prior to Johns Hopkins, she held positions at Harvard University, the Electric Power Research Institute, Shell Canada, the University of Calgary, and the Laboratory on International Law and Regulation at the University of California, San Diego. She earned her doctorate in environmental design from the University of Calgary in 2010 and a Bachelor of Science in Physics with a minor in computer science from Memorial University in 2003. She teaches a variety of courses, including life cycle assessment and climate science, economics, and policy. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jordan.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Nwankor, Chichi, my friend. So for inviting me to give these remarks, I just wanted to start by just saying, wow, that was really impressive. I was just, I learned a lot, and I'm just, so impressed by all the great work all of you are doing. Again, I'm Professor Sarah Jordan. I work in sustainable energy. Now, kind of starting, I thought about giving these remarks and your presentations. I saw your executive summaries before I came. And I thought back to male involvement in female empowerment, which I heard a little bit in some of your talks. So I wanted to start with a quote from Nelson Mandela in a Women's Day speech from 1996. He said, "The legacy of oppression weighs heavily on women. As long as women are bound by poverty and as long as they are looked down upon, human rights will lack substance. As long as outmoded ways of thinking prevent women from making meaningful contributions to society, progress will be slow. As long as the nation refuses to acknowledge the equal role of more than half of itself, it is doomed to failure." Now, nearly 30 years later, these words still hold, obviously not just for South Africa, but for the countries we spoke about today, and in many respects, even for the country in which we reside. So thinking about your presentations, what I really found most uplifting and exciting is that all of your work really hit upon the major challenges presented in this speech nearly 30 years ago. Really creative solutions and also with academic rigor. Now, the academic rigor really, and I want to emphasize this for the question period as well, enabled that cultural context that's necessary for developing solutions in countries that are not your own. So certainly noted that. So how will women gain equal footing without financial access, agency, and equal opportunity? Even so, how can we ensure that they are prepared to face the increasing aspects and impacts of climate change and the need to adapt? So identifying these biases and what inhibits inclusion can really play an enormous role. So starting with the work that was done with Sri Lanka and Kazakhstan, for example, really pointed to the awareness of credit and finance, that education being critical, the role of partnerships and networks. Safe mobility, I thought, was a really important aspect in terms of reducing the chance of even violence towards women. The comparative case of Ghana and Nigeria, I feel really provided some important and much needed recommendations to put women in leadership roles in agriculture. So just going beyond leadership roles, but also thinking through the climate challenges being faced today in terms of climate smart commodities. The challenge of unpaid care work also points to the need to ensure that sexual health and reproductive rights of women globally are recognized as well as respected. And then also the 3 R's being a really innovative and catchy way to make the case for solutions crafted for Rwanda, but you can see the impacts beyond. So the mental health and well-being in emerging markets, Bangladesh and Indonesia present opportunities to commence to solve such challenges using the business case. So healthy, happy workplace is better for productivity, I thought was a really great note to end on. I believe I've made it through all of them. Oh, right, the case of Indonesia. It exemplified the important challenges in women face in becoming political leaders through ensuring access and opportunity. And this, I thought, really spoke to Mandela's quote about outmoded ways of thinking about women, and in this case, particularly in politics. So how can we really ensure that women with different marital statuses and come from different backgrounds can really enable their success in political leadership? And of course, the critical component of equal opportunity in Nigeria and the early warning and early response efforts, I thought was really innovative and an excellent example of finding these synergistic creative solutions that hit on not just one aspect of a solution, but combine several aspects of solutions. So kind of bringing this all together and hopefully providing a good backbone for the discussion, I wanted to address some common threads throughout the presentations that really bring home this notion of creative solutions that I was so excited to see, and again, bringing that academic rigor and creative context, cultural context. The access to finance, networks, partnerships, programmatic improvements, as well as transparency and accountability, education, capacity building, and importantly, ensuring that women have agency and opportunity. So I heard, a lot of amazing solutions that you came up with, again, within your specific cultural context, but at the same time, there's a lot of these common threads that we can bring to creating solutions in other places and even globally. Okay, a few closing statements. I'm sure I'm already at my time. I hope I haven't forgotten any of the great ideas. It's impossible to cover everything that you've done in just 10 minutes. So just a quick statement to SAIS Women Lead. I just wanted to say even more after today, I get really excited to see what students do next. So I know we have an alumni in this room, but really I see what you've done here as the first step towards enabling women in leadership roles and driving positive change globally, okay? So that means here, abroad, everywhere. So I think that's really exciting to see. You've really exemplified the thoughtfulness in the development of your creative solution that really were driven by local engagement, okay? So the local engagement being key towards these solutions that will actually work on the ground. So huge congratulations. I'm so impressed. I really enjoyed what you did, and of course to the students, but also this comes as no surprise under the leadership of Professor Nwankwo to see such amazing and thoughtful solutions towards achieving gender equality. So on that note, I'm going to pass back to Professor Nwankwo to lead the discussion, and thank you again so much for such excellent presentations.
Thank you so very much, Sarah. We're lucky to have you here. And so at this point, we'll open up for Q&A and comments, right? Questions, answers, and comments. And the mic is available for anybody who wants to, or any intervention, right? Because this is also a university place. So if you want to make an intervention into the frameworks, whatever, whichever way you want to engage with the presentations, we will be glad to have you do that. And yes, Bianca.
My question, ironically, was for someone who's sitting right next to me, but I wanted to ask you, following what you said, mostly in regards to how we can bring out of local context what we've learned. A lot of us focused a lot on making sure we respect with integrity the data that we collect. And thinking, at least for instance, for our example of mental health, there's a lot of programs now and excellent research attempting to establish causality of these programs with higher productivity, better work hours, better mental health conditions. And some of these RCTs, some of these papers are not telling us what we'd love to hear. So how do we take that rigorous research that at times is so extracted despite having local data from the actual place and learn from it in a way that is substantive and informative, even though when we might speak to garment workers in Bangladesh, even though the numbers don't tell us what we'd like to hear, they're telling us that these programs are extremely important. So how do we bridge that gap between funding such important research that does so much work to establish these causal relationships and then the gap we find when we are on the ground?
Oh, is that working? It was on mute this entire time. So yeah, thank you so much for the question. So, you know, I do a lot of work in sustainable energy, and there's a very large taboo in terms of presuming what will work in specific contexts, which is why, to me, when I hear the local engagement, I see that as so critical to having actual uptake of ideas. But I really appreciated your question in terms of thinking broadly, because if you take things out of the social context and you just have some report that's supposed to be broad and ambiguous, then you know how can it work in different places? So I'd say there would be two solutions that I would propose based on my experience and knowledge, and one would be certainly to the whole notion of these adaptable frameworks. Many of you know, like the 3 Rs or what have you, bringing out some of these frameworks that you can see aren't necessarily fully prescriptive. We're not going to tell you exactly how to build capacity, but we can see that we can bring this context into different situations where you can develop more contextual capacity building, for example. So one would be bringing the framework. The other one is I certainly see there as value. So there are some specific solutions. For example, if you look at the safe mobility, for example, of course that's important everywhere, but it might be particularly important for one program. Okay, so that was really important. But there was a whole bunch of other common threads. And when you start to see these really important common threads, I think pretty much all of you mentioned partnerships and networks and the strength of community. So you know, using those things that we are seeing commonly throughout each of your presentations, I would suggest would be the other aspect that I would bring in, other than these more versatile frameworks. But there's a really great question.
Thank you. Does anyone else want the mic?
All right, well, congrats students on your presentations. My question is really for any of you that want to take it, but I was wondering how your research with the practicum and your work and your experiences affected what you plan to do after SAIS, if anything. Thank you.
Yeah, so I could say that it really affected me. I was always interested in pro-democracy and good governance reforms. I worked on that when I was living in Mongolia on my Fulbright and did that prior to coming to SAIS as a research assistant. But I actually, thanks to IRI, I have a position now working as a program associate. So I'll be working in their Laos and Cambodia office, working kind of with civil society organizations to try and promote electoral reform. So yeah.
I wanted to say, before this practicum, so I came into SAIS expecting, I did not want to work in business. I assumed I wanted to work in government. Through this practicum, I've discovered the amount of impact that NGOs can have. I had underestimated it, and so working with IRI has shown me the kinds of work that NGOs can do and a little bit of the variety of different kinds of NGOs that there are. And I also have an internship with the Laos and Cambodia team at IRI.
Okay, hi everybody. In case you can't see me behind this mask, I'm Cinnamon Dornsife. I've been with SAIS 20 years and I now run the Foreign Policy Institute. But, you know, it's the professor in me. I just had to ask a question to each one of the groups. And I asked Chi-Chi if that was okay. So I have a question for each one of the groups. Okay, ready. So the first group. So women's inclusion in early warning and response in northern Nigeria. My question there was, what did you find most surprising and why? For the group that looked at the impact of climate change on women farmers in Ghana and Nigeria, I wondered who owns the follow-up? For the global assessment of unpaid care work, I wondered, were there any examples of local male champions to kind of take that forward? For women's political representation, barriers for entry to women political candidates in Indonesia, I was particularly interested in the provinces you picked. I lived and worked in Indonesia for 6 years, and I was wondering about the role of religion. And so the fact that you picked those two provinces, the new provinces in eastern Indonesia, I found that really interesting. And North Sumatra also has a high concentration of Christianity, so I wondered what about that. And probably because I lived in Indonesia for all those years, I have two questions for you guys. So what about the role of journalism and kind of name and shame? Because it seems to me that that is a really effective way to move things forward for our promoting women's financial inclusion in South and Central Asia. I wonder if, I think I know the answer to this. For students that were a part of that group, did you take the financial inclusion class? I know at least one did, because I had her as a student in my class as well. And just what did you find most relevant in the financial inclusion class for your capstone? And then lastly, for tackling mental health and well-being, the project with the IFC, I wonder, did you see any spillover to government policy and budgets for all of your work in the private sector? And you don't necessarily have to answer all of those. You can just, oh my gosh, uh-oh. This is dangerous in having a professor here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so I think we're going to take it in the order that you presented, right? Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Thank you so much for your question. So one of the things we found most surprising was how women are able to see early warnings of violence within their own children. And for example, when we were interviewing a key informant for the KIIs, she was telling us that a lot of women notice little things in their boys, for example, like they're distant in the family or they come home with a really expensive car all of a sudden. And so they know that those are signs that they're being involved in activities and groups that they really shouldn't be. And, you know, the role of women, as Michaela mentioned, with the social networks, how they can easily spread that information or share it amongst each other, and how important that is. We really had no idea how crucial that was to early warning and early response. And then another thing that was surprising to us was the level of support that they receive from their families when they are first responders. Their husbands, their mothers and fathers, they're very supportive of the role that they play in their community's protection. So that was really nice to know. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the question. I understood that as in once the study is done, who will do the follow-up work? Okay. So the NGO that we worked with, they do investigative journalism. So they will use the key findings from our report and their advocacy efforts and approach the government and other stakeholders and kind of raise awareness about the challenges we identified and the recommendations we gave to them. So that's the next step. And CJID is basically responsible for taking this on from us and doing with it what they do, which is advocate for female farmers.
Hi. So I believe your question was talking about the champion of like male engagement, specifically for the unpaid care. Yes. So through our key informant interviews, we had the privilege of speaking with Dr. Gary Barker. He's the CEO and founder of Promundo and Men Care. And this was actually a really good interview because we learned what male engagement and the State of the Father report, we took a lot from that. And Dr. Barker, told us kind of that the goal of fathers and of male engagement is trying to change the understanding of care, and that we are humans and that we need care, and that this is something that should be shared between partners. And so he worked really hard to implement local programs and to specifically act as just an aid with local organizations. And Sunning will talk more about the specific program, but it was working with fathers at a very early age and at the infancy of fatherhood, and understanding the fundamentals of care and giving agency to the groups in Rwanda to do this and not parachuting in and really working with them. So Promundo and Men Care was super important in providing that perspective.
Yeah, just to add up to that point, one of their flagship program is called Program P, which is a program that engages men in women's pregnancy through pregnancy to a child's early childhood. And they find that this is a good entry point to work with men because they are willing to engage in their own child's life and early childhood development. And it also helps to change the social norms on the ground, and also helps building couple relations and reducing gender-based violence, which helping to men sharing more unpaid care work domestically. And this program has been implemented around the world in like a dozen of countries, including our case study country, Rwanda.
Thank you. For the religion question, so most of us came into the Indonesia program. We didn't know a lot about Indonesia before we started, so we didn't really pick the regions. It was the IRI that proposed them to us. And it turned out working very well for us, because if we hadn't had the diversity of the interviewees and the respondents, we wouldn't have known that religious communities and religious networks are as powerful as they are everywhere throughout the board. We did experience some differences in gender roles and gender expectations, specifically right in Aceh, where Sharia law is the law. Otherwise, trends were kind of diverse, I would say. Some participants who wore hijab said they didn't experience legal or any other boundaries while campaigning or barriers, and other candidates did experience them no matter the religion. So it was a diverse impact on that end.
In terms of your second question on journalism, so that was not the focus of our study at all, but luckily I'm in a class on Indonesia, so I can answer. My understanding is the journalism environment in Indonesia is highly concentrated in Jakarta, and it's hard to get coverage of almost anywhere else. And so that means in provincial politics, journalism plays virtually no role. Much more influential than formal media is just interpersonal relationships, especially like religious or clan networks, things like that. And then, so journalism can't really play a role at these subnational levels. At a national level, it certainly does play an important role, but even that role is mixed. So you've got great institutions like the Jakarta Post that are really sort of pro-democracy and pro-holding the government accountable. And then you also have, for example, the primary funder of one of the major political parties, Golkar, is also a media tycoon and uses his media apparatus to advocate for Golkar politicians and policies. So the power of media has the potential to be extremely influential in Indonesia, but it suffers from elite capture and just a lack of a high concentration in Jakarta, so that its application to outside areas is extremely reduced.
So we were the financial inclusion group, and what we found was basically that financial inclusion, at large had a lot less to do with what was happening inside the bank itself, but was happening in society. And so how can women get to the bank safely? How can they access their credit score? What collateral do they need to show for a loan? What are pathways into employment in banks if they want to work in the banking institution? So what we found is financial inclusion has we actually started this project looking at AI algorithms, and we weren't able to access them, so we completely switched, looking more at societal norms. And so I am actually kind of glad we switched, because I think that actually has a lot more importance and like relevance in the region right now.
Thank you. So you asked about spillovers, right, towards the government. So I'll answer this question in two parts. I think in regards to externalities that come from the private sector providing mental health, those obviously lead to benefits in the government for that to happen or when that happens. But what we concluded from our research is that the biggest role, especially at this level where the IFC feels comfortable coming in engagement with employers, is speaking to the government. For instance, in Bangladesh, we just recently rewrote the Mental Health Care Act from the Lunacy Act that was up until 2018. And now the implementation plan of that policy is in course, which allows the IFC to hopefully, when it engages with employers, to also have that conversation with government, especially when it comes to standardization of training for psychologists, psychiatrists, because that's the mix of quality is probably one of the biggest issues, whether you're getting private or public care. The other aspect of the question is whether it will actually lead to those spillovers to begin with. So if we don't take the assumption that I just took, because employers, especially in Bangladesh, a lot of these who just want to tick the boxes, especially in banking or ICT, what they end up doing is going to India and having telecom really cheap services for mental health, which have terrible outcomes and terrible take-up rates to actually upkeep the program. So our suggestions and recommendation to the IFC, and this is kind of great in regards to the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group, provides further incentives for these to actually have local care. And at that point, if we can convince employers that they're going to have the best productivity benefits when they provide care locally, that is gender sensitive, and that they have the space to have one-to-one counseling and not just telehealth, that's when those spillovers can happen. I hope that that addressed your question.
Hi there, thank you so much for the presentations. My name is Bryant with IRI's Women's Democracy Network. I have two questions, if that's all right. One, yes. One is for the team that explored unpaid care work in Rwanda. When looking at best practices, you mentioned you looked at close to a dozen different approaches, both national and local. Were there any best practices that you saw that instead of looking to redistribute unpaid care work, focused more on remunerating unpaid care work, or perhaps instead of making it the burden of the private sector, making it more public? And if so, do you see that as a sustainable way to scale it out to other countries? And the other question I have is for the team that worked with IRI. As you know, we have not reached our goal of where we want to be in terms of gender equity in the ELA programming. We have a lot more men than women. So do you have any recommendations for us within the scope of the NED grant that we're working with to engage our existing male participants to promote and amplify women's participation?
Yeah, for the question for Women Deliver about remunerating the unpaid care work, we also found two examples of counting or measuring the unpaid care work into GDP, like to make it more numerical and countable for unpaid care work. We found an example in South Korea that they have a policy to include unpaid care work into their GDP measurement. And we also found an example of counting women's work organization that they also make it numerical.
I also have one more, and it was the Education Development Center that changed the concept of care work and made it into a job. So they were creating early childhood development centers, which was in terms of private practice. And what they would do is they would create these childhood development centers, and they would allow women to go and learn the latest skills in care. So the women were getting jobs in care work and then learning the best practices of care. So it was actually turning unpaid care work into paid care work and learning the best skills to put in their community.
So you asked about engaging men who are in ELA training in supporting women and advocating for women's greater participation. So in our recommendations, we highlighted a couple things about candidates cooperating with each other, and we specifically, I think we framed it in terms of women cooperating with women because these are methods for candidates that lack resources, and women tend to lack resources more than men. Also because we mostly discovered these cooperation techniques when talking to women and asking them about women. However, these techniques would equally work between women and male candidates. The cooperation techniques are things like sharing transportation when you both have to go to the same rural area to campaign, sharing printers if you rent it for a day, a massive industrial printer for a day, and you both get to print it or something like that. Sharing resources like that in a way that benefits both candidates, but has a stronger benefit for those who lack the resources to do those things on their own, particularly women candidates. And then hopefully, if we can institute a system, if IRI can help encourage a system where men and women collaborate on things like that, it would also help counteract one of the issues we found, which was women thinking that they are perceived as token candidates, as candidates in name only, as that their political abilities are not recognized. And so if you can foster these collaborations between male and female candidates who are not party leaders, eventually some of those people will become party leaders and hopefully have a stronger inclination towards treating women as real candidates.
I would say within the scope of the ELA training, right, there could also be a section for men that is about masculinity and seeing maybe, what men think about women's issues or if they are even aware of that. And if men take women candidates seriously or if they see them as token and why.
And just to follow that up, I think something that we didn't necessarily go into depth on, but we did kind of mention, is that we really think that people gained significantly from having political mentors. And so if we can get kind of like incumbent politicians or party leadership, regardless of whether they're male or female, to really engage with incoming candidates, it might kind of help the system, help people understand each other despite kind of inequalities in terms of political power. And so putting together a mentor program might really help to engage all candidates regardless of gender.
Okay. I had another thought, apologies. The other thing is a lot of our recommendations talked about how to make that women candidates would benefit from ELA training focusing more on women's issues, on the challenges faced by women candidates, and also, as we talked about, polling what are women and children's issues, how do those vary across regions. If that is a bigger part of training, then men who participate in that training will also have to confront the idea that women are important voters. Women have unique perspectives. Women are a power base to engage with, and potentially that women political candidates have a better in with those voters than male political candidates, thus also incentivizing alliances between male and female candidates and considering women candidates real politicians.
Thank you. Anyone else?
All right. Thank you very much, Cinnamon, for that line of questions. And so we have come to the end of the formal session, and we can now have the party. But before that, I want to thank folks that have worked with us throughout the year. Thank you, Jenny, for all you've done. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, events. Brittany, thank you, Sonia, thank you, Destiny, thank you, Mo. Without you all, this wouldn't have been possible. And thank you, my friends in this room, for your friendship and advice. And more importantly, thank you, teams, students, for your dedication, your commitment. I can't wait to see where you go. I really cannot wait to see where you go. And please don't be strangers, right? We are counting on you to mentor the groups that will be coming in. And I think the application is out now, yeah? When you get the jobs, we need funding here in SAIS Women Lead, right? Just saying. All right, thank you so very much. And let's do this again next year. And food is right there at the back. Thank you.